Well, I think this is a really important topic because it actually pertains, in a broader sense, to how we end this catastrophe and what it effectively entails. It's not just President Biden, by the way, this is a bipartisan effort, which I call the Uniparty. They've garnered support from Republicans and Democrats in great numbers to prolong this destructive and pointless proxy war against Russia for as long as possible. Ultimately, they, or at least his supporters or managers or handlers, whatever you want to call them, aim to perpetuate this. I mean, sadly, it's a cash cow for a lot of the wrong people in Washington. A friend of mine pointed out to me the other day, "Doug, have you taken a ride around Washington, D.C., driven through Potomac, Maryland, and then over to Great Falls and McLean and so forth? Have you seen the enormous estates, mansions, whatever you want to call them, that have sprung up in these areas, largely as a consequence of this unending series of interventions and wars?" These are people who have operated within the broader framework of the military-industrial congressional complex, and they've stuffed huge quantities of cash into their pockets. Ukraine promises to keep a lot of that going, although just as a safeguard, in case, for some reason, the cash cow called Ukraine stops producing. We've always got China and the imminent threat to Taiwan, which, of course, is nonsense. So, these things are all part and parcel of the same thing. How do we sustain this $28 billion here, $30 billion there that pays people very, very well inside the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, and the defense industries and so forth? That justifies lots of pointless headquarters and 4 stars and so on? First of all, it doesn't matter what he does because you can undo executive arrangements overnight. You know, this is not a treaty that was approved by the Senate that then becomes law. So, whatever he thinks he's doing when he signs something as an executive agreement, those things can be overturned in 24 hours with a new president. So, I don't see that as ominous as others would see it. I think it gets to this issue of Washington not wanting to end this conflict, which is very foolish and very dangerous. So then, the next question is, how does it end? Well, I think it ends in 3 ways. First of all, the Russians, who have been very deliberate and very cautious about moving forward against Ukrainians, in the hopes that someone with common sense would come forward and negotiate an end to this, finally conclude that that's hopeless. They press all the way to the Dnieper River, they press right into Kiev, and they cross the river in the south and take Odessa because they see no alternative. And even then, if there's no willingness to come to some sort of arrangement, well, then they call up another 400,000 or 500,000 troops and they go all the way to the Polish and Romanian borders. So, that's one way this could end. The second way that it ends is a financial economic crisis. We have a lot. It's interesting to watch the news this morning, and the usual suspects on the various cable news networks are saying, "Oh, what a great week in the stock market." Well, I'm sure it was a very good week, but what they don't bother telling anybody is that we are as close to the kind of disaster as we have ever been in our history. And all of a sudden, all these great gains in the so-called stock market could be wiped out in the space of a few minutes. Now, why? Everyone will come forward with a different theory, but the bond yields are up, the prices are down, and at some point, massive numbers of banks both inside the United States and around the world are going to look at all these treasury bonds that they invested in 20 years ago when the interest rates were very, very low and discover that, gosh, they're worthless. How do I get rid of these damn things? And when that happens, you're going to have a fire sale like nobody's ever seen, and that will produce an implosion in the financial system. Now, some people will step forward and say, "Well, look, this happened to the British not long ago, I guess in the spring and March, and the Bank of England said, no, we'll buy up whatever is necessary, and they managed to get past the crisis." Well, the same conditions that applied to Great Britain a few months ago still apply there, and they apply here, and you're not going to be able to get past it. And we cannot simply buy up all these bonds, it's just not possible. Now, you add to this the toxic debt that is already on the Fed spreadsheets and balance, and then go even further, look at the banks around the country. The Silicon Valley Bank was just the beginning. We've had more banks fail, we continue to hear that more banks are failing. At some point, all of it fails. Now, then you ask someone like Nassim Taleb, this is the gentleman that invented the concept of the black swan, when does it all happen? And he'll look at you and say, "Well, Armageddon is in view, but I can't tell you when it's going to happen." Yeah, I can't either, but it's very definitely there. And you have also these other exogenous forces, things beyond the United States, like the Ukraine war. What happens in Ukraine doesn't seem to matter very much to most Americans, but let me tell you something. If the Russians press ahead and crush everything and then start moving west, that will have a big impact in Europe, and that impact will be felt here. And the Europeans are ultimately more fragile in the economic and financial sense, as you know, than we are. Germany and France really are the most important states in Europe. Germany is already in a deep recession, and there's no easy way out of it. They've been on a path of national suicide from the moment they decided to join this anti-Russian proxy war. I don't see an easy way for them to get out. France is obvious. France is a seething, boiling pot of anger and hostility because millions of non-Europeans flooded into that country and threatened the very existence of France, not just French national identity, French history and culture, but France the nation-state itself. The rest of Europe is watching, and you know what they always say about Paris: when Paris coughs, the rest of Europe gets a cold. And I think you're going to see something very much like that occur. So, to briefly sum up, that's another way the war ends. Everybody just goes broke overnight, cuts their losses, and gets out. And the Europeans are already pulling back. We are not, because, frankly, $28 billion is decimal dust to us when you have a $34 trillion debt and you're almost up to a 0% debt to GDP ratio. What difference does another $28 billion make? That's where we are. So, that's one way. And then there's another way, and this is one that everybody wants, but no one can find evidence for it, and that is if someone steps forward, either leading Europe or even here in the United States, and says, we want an off-ramp, we want to end this. Well, I don't see that happening in Washington. So, the only other way this happens is if the Europeans break away from us, and of course, that would mean fundamentally the end of NATO. You've already got the EU on life support. Everybody hates the EU. You can find different reasons in every country. The Germans don't like it because they're tired of being the cash for Europe, but everybody else in Europe likes to blame the Germans for all of their problems. So, this is a bizarre set of circumstances, but everybody's fed up with the EU. And this is why no one in Washington, and certainly none of the current governments in Europe, are willing to step forward and make peace, because to do so is an existential threat to them. They are at war with the Russian state and the Russian people. The rest of us are not. They're at war because they've decided that Russia, this last nation-state left in Europe that won't open its borders to millions of non-Europeans and non-Christians, they do have 20 to 25% Muslims. But those Muslims are overwhelmingly very content to live in Russia, and, by the way, that's not new. In 1915, the Turks thought they were going to launch an Islamist crusade and liberate all the Muslims from Tsarist Russia. They crossed the Caucasus and found no one was interested in being liberated because the people were quite content to live under the Tsar. We have a similar situation today in Moscow. But the point is that Russia is not going to knuckle under. It's not going to bow down to our financial hegemony. It's not going to tolerate our military hegemony. It's not going to accommodate our political dominance. So, the only way this ends in the third sense is for the Europeans to step forward and say, enough's enough. And of course, that's something we don't want, but frankly, I think we're doing everything in our power to make that happen. A mutual friend between us, Max Blumenthal of the Gray Zone, mentioned in an interview with me that, as he drives around Washington, D.C., it's just these McMansions going up everywhere, and as you dig in and research, they're almost all connected to the military-industrial complex. So, he says, on the one hand, they're flying the Ukrainian flag. On the other hand, if that war stops, they can't pay their mortgage. You know, so they have more incentive to keep this thing going. The other thing that stood out to me in the last week was I had Ray McGovern on, and he said, whether it's true or not, Russia has to be America's boogeyman, or you can't justify an $800 billion military budget. What are your thoughts on Mr. McGovern's comment? Well, you know, Ray is a great person. He makes great points, but he's wrong. Okay, you eliminate Russia from the equation and you have China. Okay, they just get a new boogeyman. Yeah, I mean, that's it. And you know, all the time, people say, you just don't understand China. And I always say, how many times have you been to Northeast Asia? How many people do you know in the region? What's your knowledge of Chinese history, culture, and civilization? The Chinese are probably the oldest continuous civilization on the planet. Where is the evidence for all of the sinister motives and designs that you're imputing to them? I don't see it. If you look carefully at China today, it's pretty much where it was in the beginning of the 20th century. It's expanded to the limits of its capabilities. It can't expand any further. They've got 1.4 billion people. Every morning, she does not wake up and think of ways to attack America. She wakes up every morning thinking of ways to hold China together. I don't think people understand that. And they want to blame the Chinese for fentanyl. Well, the Chinese are making it and selling it, and in many cases, it's Chinese organized crime. In a nation of 1.4 billion that has a long history of criminality and what I would call black market operations, it's pretty tough to crack down on all of that and hold it together. But in the case of China right now, the stuff is coming into the United States via the drug cartels that operate out of Mexico and the Caribbean basin. Those are your problems, not China. So, you shut down the border, secure the border, and restore the rule of law inside the United States. Stop this nonsense of releasing criminals and slapping people on their hands who probably should be executed, frankly. And instead, install a government that protects the people. Remember, government has to do 3 things. It has to protect the population, it has to shelter the population, and it has to feed the population. She is doing that, Putin is doing that, our government is not doing that. It's not protecting us in the least. All you have to do is open the newspapers, watch cable television, you'll get a fraction of what's actually happening, but the criminality in our country is epidemic. I mean, you go to a gas station in Philadelphia, you're lucky you're not being shot on the spot. You know, you try to shop, you can't, the place is being looted, all the major stores are leaving. Look at San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia, it's terrible. But no one wants you to look at that. It's almost like, don't pay any attention to that, look at the threat from Russia, look at the threat from China. But the truth is, Ukraine is of no strategic, vital interest to us, never has been, and the regime sitting in Kyiv is hardly the paragon of democracy, it's the opposite, it's worse than that. It's almost Stalinist at this point, and it's an organized crime state. It was when the war began. So, this is all nonsense, but you know, Max is correct, people are profiting enormously from it, and they don't think it harms them. But then there's this other possibility, and that is that we're dumb, we do stupid things, and we try to intervene in Western Ukraine at the last minute to try and rescue our credibility, which is already in the gutter anyway with most of the world, and we bring on a major war with the Russians. What we don't understand right now is that we have threatened and bullied the Chinese for years to the point where the Chinese have convinced themselves they've got to prepare to defend themselves against us and our attacks. So, what are they going to do? Well, they're going to join with the Russians. So now you're at a war that involves not simply the Russian state and its armed forces, which are, by the way, better and more capable than China's, but nevertheless, you know, you've got Chinese scientific industrial power and manpower linked to Russia. And what about the rest of the world? All you have to do is look at BRICS, look at the recent acquisitions of BRICS, you know, Saudi Arabia, whose importance to us cannot be overstated when it comes to the petrodollar. Saudi Arabia has just announced, we're joining BRICS, they plan to join this new gold-backed currency. What's happening to our financial hegemony? It's being eroded away as we sit here and talk. The world is going to dollarize. It's not going to happen overnight. It won't happen in 6 months. It'll happen in a year, in 2 years, in 3 years, but the handwriting is on the wall. Why? Everyone is sick of us. So, Max is right, but it's even worse than Max suggests. We've created this whole ruling political class that is entirely dependent on governmental largesse. It's in their interest to do these things. And that's why when I've talked to people, I said, how do you explain the open borders? I mean, what the hell is going on? Why would we do such a thing? Why would we invite millions of people into this country from all sorts of places? It's no longer just Latin America. We have 1/3 of the Mexican population or more living in the country anyway. But you go beyond that, now you're picking up people from Africa, the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent, Asia. Why? 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 Well, it tends to create the illusion or at least the possibility that, so deluded by all of these non-Americans that have been welcomed into our country, that we have no chance of ever governing ourselves again. We will be governed by this political class who's resting comfortably on the foundation of all these foreigners. This is a very dangerous thing that bodes ill for the future of the United States because at some point when things get rough and people can't eat, Americans are not different from Frenchmen or Germans or anyone else. They start to look around and say, wait a minute, why can't I find something to eat because this man over here is not even an American? What he's competing for is the same thing I am. Why is he here? Why does he enjoy this? This is why I brought up the fact that all of these so-called migrants, illegals, whatever you want to call them, asylum seekers, which is a lot of nonsense, who are being allowed into the country, are handed $2,200 a month. Then they're told, here's a ticket to wherever you want to go in the United States. We'll send you there. But we won't pay or cannot pay the average American worker who works all of his life and pays into Social Security more than about $1,400 a month. What's wrong with this picture? This is insane.